But I'm so excited today that we are finishing up our series on Black theology and Black preaching with Andrew Scales, the Reverend Dr. Andrew Scales. Andrew is an adjunct professor of homiletics at Princeton Theological Seminary. He is a classmate of Anna's. He serves as the chaplain and executive co-director of the Princeton Presbyterian's campus ministry, where he serves along with his wife, the Reverend Lynn Turner Scales. From 2011 to 2014, Andrew and Lynn served as associate pastors at Davidson College Presbyterian Church and Hopewell Presbyterian Church, respectively. And so he is a friend of the Presbytery and knows and loves Charlotte very well. He is thrilled to be with us today for adult education. And as he said, he wishes he could go to Mertz or the King's Kitchen after worship with us. So we will hold him to that. And once this pandemic's over, we will take him to all his favorite restaurants when he is able to come visit us. Andrew, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you, sir.
Robert, thank you for such a warm introduction, and I am so glad to be with you all this morning, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this series on Black theology and Black preaching. As Robert said, I teach homiletics, which is the department preaching at the seminary, and I work with wonderful colleagues and learn from African-American teachers of preaching, preachers, pastors, leaders of congregations. And so I'm so glad to join you all for Sunday school for adult education and to bring some of their writing and insights and thoughts on Black preaching and Black preaching traditions. So thank you all for having me, Gerald and Robert, for welcoming me so warmly into this space. Why don't we begin before I share the screen with my PowerPoint presentation that's going to help us for this morning. Why don't I begin with a word of prayer? Let's pray. Loving and gracious God, we thank you so much for the voices of our neighbors, for the traditions of Black preaching that continue to inspire and to move people to rejoice, to be honest about the struggles of life, and to also call forth justice in our world. We thank you for the many witnesses you have gathered over the years, and may we learn from them today so that we may also do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with you all our days. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'm going to begin by sharing this screen, and give me just a moment to set up the slideshow. So I've titled this this class, Listening to Our Neighbors, the Joy and Promises of Black Preaching. And the reason I did that is because I believe and know that we are surrounded by incredibly faithful voices in our neighbors. There are congregations throughout Charlotte and in my area in New Jersey of Black congregations, historically Black congregations, who are gathering every Sunday, and we don't always know all the modes and traditions and rhythms of worship. And so we have an opportunity to do some work on our own and also to be in conversation with our neighbors in learning about this really beautiful tradition of preaching and different ways of thinking about the gospel from our neighbors. And so, let me move to the next slide. One way that I like to frame this, it is an introduction to Black preaching. It's by no means the comprehensive introduction to Black preaching. It's a few voices and depictions of Black preaching. And one of the ways to think about that, a really helpful metaphor that was introduced to me by the book Sisters in the Wilderness by Dolores Williams, a womanist scholar, so a Black feminist scholar, is the metaphor of the mosaic. And so if you've seen, maybe medieval or ancient depictions of Jesus, they're little pieces of glass, of colored glass, that make a larger picture of Jesus or some kind of depiction of a story from the Bible. And So the mosaic functions as a metaphor also for talking about Black preaching, meaning that there is a huge diversity of traditions in the United States that fall under the umbrella of Black preaching. And so there are mainline, historically Black congregations. So I was familiar with Davidson Presbyterian Church when I was serving in North Carolina. C.N. Jenkins Memorial Church, where Jerry Cannon is pastor and preacher there. Maybe you can also name other mainline denominational churches that are historically African American. Then there are also African American denominations like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Church of God in Christ, National Baptist, that are predominantly or majority African American congregations that make up the denomination. There's Pentecostals, Presbyterians, there's Black Catholic traditions in the United States, as well as different theological and cultural and regional differences too. But there are also some distinctives and particularities that scholars have been reflecting on, and I'm going to introduce a few of those today. I think another thing that I always think about when talking about Black preaching is that it is certainly a topic that we can learn about, but I also love the emphasis of learning from. And so the idea that these voices have insight into the gospel that we may not have spent a lot of time reflecting on, or maybe new to us. And so we are learning from our neighbors, in addition to learning about Black preaching as a subject. And then I also want to highlight something that I've experienced throughout my work as a teacher and a learner of preaching, is the incredible hospitality in the Black church tradition. And Wilda Gaffney, who's a biblical scholar, an African-American biblical scholar, uses the metaphor of inviting people as guests for supper. She writes as a Southern Black womanist scholar and intentionally uses supper to name the conviviality, the abundance of food, the use of family recipes, and that all are welcome to learn from this tradition and engage in conversation and be in fellowship with Black churches. And I think that hospitality is something that is incredibly beautiful. And so we're going to draw from that offer of hospitality today by listening to our neighbors. So three main points I want to make today are that Black preaching, and especially in the context of worship, creatively engages with God's word with the whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. I also want to talk about briefly how Black preaching celebrates and affirms Black people's dignity and belovedness. And then finally, how Black preaching takes a prophetic stance to the world against injustice. And I'm going to move quickly through those three with voices from Black preaching traditions. So one of my very favorite teachers of preaching in Black traditions is my mentor at Princeton Theological Seminary, Cleophas LaRue. And he wrote a book about 20 years ago called The Heart of Black Preaching that traces some of the outlines of many Black preaching traditions. And you may have noticed, I've heard from Robert that you all have been joining in worship with neighbors in African-American congregation in the Charlotte area. Is that First United Presbyterian Church? Do I have that right? Yeah, thank you. And you know, often when I step into a worship space in the Black preaching tradition, I am joyfully surprised by the energy and the enthusiasm and the joy that comes, especially in the preaching moment. And part of that is the sense that even in a world that often denigrates or dehumanizes Black experiences, especially in North America, the Black church has carved out a space to celebrate their humanity, celebrate the God who has delivered them from times of trial, to celebrate the joy of salvation, and to lift up their very best expressions of praise on a Sunday morning. And so Dr. LaRue talks a lot about how the rhetorical outlines and the rhetorical attention to preparing a Black sermon brings out a sense of the holy that preaching is a sacred moment to hear a word from God, and to hear a word from God that is delivered to people who need to hear it from Sunday to Sunday. And so part of the movement, you may notice, is that often in Black preaching, there's a sense that the energy starts low with some introductory remarks, sort of setting the table, outlining what the sermon's going to be about, maybe even the architecture of the sermons, the points that are going to be made that morning. And then there's a sense of getting involved in the text and a sense of being a part of God's story. He calls that rising high, meaning that the energy starts to develop and the congregation joins in. You may hear amen, or yes, say it, or keep going, preacher. Words kind of call and response is some of the language that's used to describe that involvement of the congregation. And then there's often a move to what's called celebration, the sense that the end of a sermon, no matter what the topic, and not every African American sermon moves in this way, but many do move to a sense that even if the sermon is about difficult topics, if it's about the hardships of life and God's solidarity in those hardships, that at the end of all things, the final word is a celebration of God's salvation. And so the celebratory moment can often bring in what Dr. LaRue calls musicality, high rhetoric, figurative language, and the church gets more and more involved in its own participation with their voices. Sometimes it can end in a song, a hymn, but these celebratory aspects, and it ends in that place. And Dr. LaRue calls that, the preacher calling it sitting down in a storm, that they've brought together all of this energy and emotion and musicality, and conclude the sermon on a high note that celebrates what God has done through Jesus Christ. So that movement of start low, rise high, strike fire, sit down in a storm. I wanted to read an example of Black preaching that blends together this high rhetoric and figurative imagery, also with sort of the ways that Black preaching also speaks directly to people where they are in ordinary language. And sometimes Dr. LaRue even talks about folk language, language that speaks directly to the heart. And so I'm just going to read this quotation from one of his sermons that's in his book, I Believe I'll Testify. He says, and he's talking about God's eternity and the power of God as a God who exists from age to age. And he writes, long after centuries of civilization shall lie closed and completed, God shall reign supreme. Long after empires and nations lay buried in the graveyards of history, God shall reign supreme. Long after time runs out, exhausted, and collapses at the feet of eternity, God shall reign supreme. There is not when he was not, and there cannot be when he shall not be. He's back behind yesterday, and he's up in front of tomorrow. Waves from two eternities dash upon his throne, and yet he remains the same. He's older than time and senior to eternity. He was before was. Back before the purple hills of eternity, before there was a who or a where or a when or there, God was. I love that because it would be easy just to say God has existed always. You could say that in a sermon, but he brings together the high figurative imagery of something like back before the purple hills of eternity, along with something that speaks directly to us, saying, before there was a who or a where, a then or a there, God was. So two kinds of poetry, high rhetoric and also speaking directly to the heart in everyday speech, blended together in the sermon. Coming back again, preaching in the Black tradition is often a communal and spirit-filled event. So Luke Powery, the dean of the chapel at Duke University over in Raleigh-Durham, talks about in much of his writing the sense that the whole congregation joins in the act of worship, and the preaching moment is no exception. And so the idea that the preacher is collaborating with, in dialogue with, the congregation. They've prepared the sermon, the preacher has, but they are also doing it together with the voices of people involved. And so the sermon is something that the Spirit is inspiring and drawing the entire body together in the different moves of the sermon, and finally in the celebration of God's good news. And so Powery writes, as the Spirit creates, nurtures, and sustains the church through preaching, the Spirit continues to work in the hearts and minds of everyone involved in the preaching event. And so the reason I introduce that is that many people are familiar with the exuberance of worship in the Black tradition and the way that people call out and speak to the preacher as he or she is preaching. But there's also a deeper theological commitment underneath that everybody is called to be involved in worship and to make the sermon happen, that it's an event that God is doing something in the lives of the listeners and participants. Oh, excuse me, I got a little turnaround. I also love in biblical criticism in African American traditions and scholarship how there's attention to a fullness of the text that includes not only what is in the text, but what is between the lines and what is left out of the biblical narrative. And so Dr. Sadler, if you were here last week, talked about Wilda Gaffney, who is a womanist scholar, a Black feminist scholar, and her book Womanist Midrash, which draws upon Jewish interpretive studies in conversation with what's often called sanctified imagination, meaning an African American tradition of reading between the lines, expanding the meaning of the text, both in what is said and what is not said. And an example I want to offer you is a biblical character who has a special resonance in many Black preaching traditions is Hajjar, the Egyptian woman who lived in slavery in Abraham and Sarah's house, who's the mother of Ishmael. The experience of slavery, of being cast out of the house, of living in the wilderness, of calling upon God, and being delivered in the wilderness by God, is something that many, especially African American women, have resonated with from the days of slavery even to today. Hajjar has been a multifaceted biblical character to reflect on the Black experience. And there's also a power in Hajjar being the only biblical character who ascribes a name directly to God. Hajjar names Yahweh El Roi, the God who sees, or the God who has seen me in my distress when she's in the wilderness with Ishmael. And Wilda Gaffney also finds a nuance in between the lines of the text. And she talks about how Hajjar is a Hebrew name, but it means the foreigner or the alien, the sojourner in biblical Hebrew, which she argues for someone who is from Egypt, that would be a really strange name for a mother to name her child stranger or alien. It doesn't seem to work because that would anticipate her role as a slave in Abraham and Sarah's household, to name her stranger in another language. And what Gaffney does with that is she looks at how in other languages, and especially in modern Arabic, but they're rooted in languages, Semitic languages from the areas around present-day Egypt, there's another name, Hajjar, which means splendid or nourishing. And so the idea that there's an ambiguity in Hagar's name, that it may actually be in her own language, Hajjar, means that she has an identity that is more and transcendent from the name that her masters have given her. Her family, she was somebody's baby, she was somebody's beloved, and that they named her and gave her a name that means splendid or nourishing instead of the stranger. And so there's a dramatic reinterpretation of Hagar's significance in the community, in Black communities, that is deeply rooted in her affirmation of her humanity and her belovedness by God. I highly recommend Wilda Gaffney's book, Womanist Midrash. It is full of wisdom and deep critical scholarship on women in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. So that's one example, the ambiguity between Hagar and Hajjar, from stranger to splendid, um, and a reclamation of identity as part of the Black experience. I also, in the second point, want to talk about how Black preaching celebrates and affirms Black people's dignity and belovedness. And I would add to that, in a world that often doesn't see or actively works against or dehumanizes Black experience. And so Austin Channing Brown recently published a memoir called I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. And she writes about her first experience going to a Black church. I think she was maybe 8 or 9 years old. But she writes here, I fell in love with the soaring voices and the songs that moved us to tears and then chased the blues away. I fell in love with peppermint dealing church mothers and hymn singing deacons. I fell in love with fiery preaching that moved so deep it would undergird you and push you to your feet in praise. I fell in love with a Jesus who saw the poor and sick and hurting, a Jesus who had bigger plans for me than keeping me a virgin, a Jesus who loved and reveled in our Blackness. And so, this idea of Black church as a space that is carved out for people to be Black on their own terms and in community and fellowship, and to see that God blesses and affirms and celebrates their Blackness alongside them. It is a Black space, and the worship is attuned to and arises out of the Black experience. Going along with that, Dolores Williams, the author of the book I mentioned earlier, Sisters in the Wilderness, talks about how Black churches are spaces to testify to the way that God has been involved in the lives of Black people, and involved in a way that moves toward deliverance, bringing them out of the wilderness into the promised land, often over and against white systems of oppression in North America. And so Williams writes in her introduction to the book, many times as a little girl, I sat in the church pew with my mother or grandmother and heard the Black believers, mostly women, testify about how far they had come by faith. They expressed their belief that God was involved in their history, that God helped them make a way out of no way. As they shared their trials, tribulations, and blessings, they asked the other communicants to pray for them. Their testimony suggested they believed their lives were about more than white people's oppression of Black people. And so that sense of testimony, of being able to share your story when there aren't many spaces to share your story otherwise, the church has provided that. And it also frames people's stories within God's story, that they are a part of a much larger and transcendent story that stretches all the way back to God's deliverance of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, and proceeds through the stories of the African American experiences in slavery, through Jim Crow segregation, even to our present day. And that Katie Cannon, another womanist scholar who is the sister of Jerry Cannon at C.N. Jenkins, one of the incredible voices of womanist scholarship, talks about how Black women experience often what she calls a triple oppression, meaning poverty, and living as a Black person, and living as a woman in North American society. And so women who are living at the most marginalized situations often in American society, they have a space to testify, to tell their story, and to offer that story as a part of, and to integrate it into the story that God is telling, and into the worship of the people of God. Which is it's a really powerful thing to be seen and heard and affirmed in worship. One of the phrases that I love in my study of Black preaching and Black theology that comes out, Dr. Sadler mentioned James Cone, who is one of the major voices. He passed away about 2 years ago, but really opened up the field of Black liberation theology. He writes about this, I think, in his book, God of the Oppressed, the idea that Black churches are communities where, in his words, everybody is a somebody. Everybody has dignity, everybody has worth, everybody has gifts. And that's a counter narrative often to the way that Black people have been represented in American culture. Um, Cone is drawing on a phrase that has been used over and over again. Dolores Williams uses it. I think I've seen it in Wilda Gaffney's work as well. I may have seen it in Wilda Gaffney's work, but it's also represented. One place I found it is in a sociological study of Black churches in the early 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression. And it was undertaken by Benjamin Mays, a white sociologist, and Joseph Nicholson, an African American pastor. And they surveyed over 600 Black congregations throughout the United States, different regions, the South, the Northeast, the Midwest. I don't know if they made it out to the West Coast. But one thing that they found in common is this idea, this phrase that Cone also uses, is that in the Black church, everybody is a somebody. And the term Negro is an outdated phrase to describe Black people or African Americans, but I'm using it in the context of this study, their writings. And they write this to explain this idea further of everybody being a somebody. The opportunity found in the Negro church to be recognized and be somebody has stimulated the pride and preserved the self-respect of many Negroes who would have been entirely beaten by life and possibly completely submerged. Everyone wants to receive recognition and feel that he is appreciated. These people receive little or no recognition on their daily job. There is nothing to make them feel that they are somebody. Frequently, their souls are crushed and their personalities disregarded. But in the church on X Street, she is Mrs. Johnson, the church clerk, and he is Mr. Jones, the chairman of the deacon board. And so Mays and Nicholson, what they're saying they talk about in the Black church is it's actually also a profound expression of democracy and democratic leadership, that people who have been, because of systemic racism, because of segregation, because of oppressive hiring practices, have had ceilings placed on how high they can rise in their company, especially in the 1930s through the 1960s. The severe limitations on the kinds of jobs that people can have, the way that people were spoken to and demeaned in being addressed as Black people, in all the dehumanizing rhetoric that Black people experience. The roles of leadership in the church enabled them to use their God-given gifts and to flourish. And so things like the deacon board or the missionary commission or serving on a session, these are places where people can pour their energy and their humanity into making a community rise and flourish. And with that refuge language, especially during the Great Migration, which was happening around this time in the late 20s, early 30s, when many people were leaving the South and coming to northern cities, Black churches were places where people could find housing, they could be connected with a job, they could find community to worship and to be affirmed in their humanity, when otherwise they would be alienated and lonely in cities like Chicago or St. Louis or New York. I want to move. I know that I am moving quickly and that y'all have to get to worship this morning. So I'm going to turn to my last theme, which is Black preaching takes a prophetic stance to the world against injustice. And so the idea of the biblical prophets being people who speak truth to power in the name of the Lord, that they claim a divine inspiration both to condemn injustices, but also to project a radical vision of shalom or wholeness, a Hebrew word that means peace. It can mean wholeness. It can mean flourishing. It also has a connotation of integratedness, that the things that have divided us are taken away. Paul in Ephesians writes about Jesus breaking down the dividing wall that separates us from one another through his cross and resurrection. And so this idea that the prophets both name what is wrong in our current age, but also articulate what is possible when God gets involved and when people participate in a God-inspired vision of the world. Kenyatta Gilbert at Howard University teaches preaching homiletics, And 2 years ago, he came out with a book that's called Exodus Preaching, crafting sermons about justice and hope. And so, sort of tracing some of the outlines of prophetic preaching in African American or Black preaching traditions. And he looks at three major biblical episodes or genres that are some of the major influences on Black prophetic preaching from the civil rights movement, from today, in what many are describing now as a new civil rights movement. And three major themes that arise are the experience of the Exodus. And so Moses being called by Yahweh to confront Pharaoh about the slavery of the Israelites and the oppression in building monuments and the grinding poverty and marginalization, being called uh, to liberate Israel and draw them out of Egypt through the wilderness and into the promised land where they can determine their own history and culture and organize themselves and farm their own land. And so the exodus of being brought out of an oppressive system has been a theme that has resonated with Black communities from the days of slavery, the hope of liberation from slavery, the hope of deliverance from the violence of Jim Crow segregation, of the Klan, of lynching, and then also being brought through into an experience where people can live in peace and flourish. Another major genre are the Hebrew prophets, Micah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, all of these voices, Jeremiah, that gather together, as I said, both to denounce idolatry and greed, the following after false gods, and instead a turning again to the living God, a God who made us and knows us and affirms the dignity of each person, and also announcing a vision of shalom. If you ever get a chance to look at the prophet Zechariah in chapter 8, there's this stunning vision of Jerusalem being restored. And what's restored are not necessarily so much the monuments and the walls, but streets that are safe to live in. And the prophet Zechariah describes children being able to play in the streets, and older people, elderly people, being able to sit in the town squares and rest and talk with one another. And the prophet says, and no one shall make them afraid. And so for many African American uh, preachers, this vision of a community where children can play safely in the streets, where elderly persons can be outside and in community and not in their trapped in their homes. This is a vision that the prophets call from ancient times to today, a community and neighborhoods and churches flourishing. And finally, um, Dr. Gilbert identifies Jesus's preaching and ministry as the model, the template of what it looks like to live out the life of faith, and to offer an alternative vision of what is possible for us even today. And so Jesus's sermon in Nazareth in Luke 4, where he quotes from the prophet Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to announce good news to the poor, and talking about recovery of sight for the blind, release of the captives, proclaiming the Jubilee, the day of the Lord's favor, this promise of liberation, of flourishing. That's how Jesus's preaching ministry really starts in the Gospel of Luke. And it is followed by acts of healing, acts of incredible generosity, of meals, gathering and including people who were excluded, but also finally Jesus's solidarity with us in his crucifixion by the state, his violent death at the hands of the Roman state. And so for many people in Black churches, Jesus, his solidarity um, in oppressive systems is something that is a profound um, comfort and encouragement to them. And a text I would recommend is James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which draws together, and Dr. Sadler mentioned this also last week, it draws together and puts in conversation the experience of lynching in African American history and American history, uh, and examines it in light of Jesus's trial and execution by the Roman state. It's a powerful and difficult book to read, but an important read for understanding the framing of violence, systemic violence against African Americans in the United States. Another vision for a prophetic vision is a reclamation of the Revelation text of the Apocalypse, the last book of the Bible, as a vision of resistance to earthly powers and a vision of God's redemption from earthly powers. And so Brian Blunt, who is a New Testament scholar and the president of Union Presbyterian Seminary, wrote recently a statement on the death of George Floyd, and he talks about how Revelation is written to communities oppressed by a violent empire, by the Roman Empire. And there are connections. He draws together Alan Bosak, a theologian's writing about apartheid in South Africa for Black people living in South Africa. He talks about Miroslav Volf's writings living in the Balkans and through the Balkan Wars. But he also talks about how for many African Americans in this commentary on Revelation, the experience of violence and systemic violence, whether it's from the police or the history of lynching, and those kinds of actions are similar to the kinds of persecution that the churches in Revelation that are featured in Revelation experience. And there's this profound claim in Revelation that Christ is Lord even in that moment and will reign at the end of time. And so after George Floyd was killed this summer in Minneapolis by a police officer, he writes in an open letter to the Union community, the seminary community, and I'm quoting him, "I'm afraid because I know that white Christians are not witnessing, not enough. You need them to witness, not just spiritually, tangibly, not just with well-intentioned prayer, with concrete action, not just from the pulpit and in the sanctuary, out in the world, on the streets of their cities, in the corridors of their power." And so I say that because I so appreciate when Robert invited me to be a part of your adult education hour, the work that you are doing in learning about anti-racism, not only as a concept, but as a way of being in the world and getting involved in the struggle for civil rights, for social justice. And so I celebrate with you this renewed commitment to getting involved, as Dr. Blunt says, with concrete action in the streets and out in the world. That's something that my own ministry, the campus ministry I serve in Princeton with my wife Len, we are also doing and learning to walk in, knowing that we'll never fully arrive at anti-racism, but that is a way of being in the world and getting involved in the struggle for a more just society. Finally, I end with someone who deeply inspires me, Dr. William Barber, who is a North Carolina pastor, is in Goldsboro at Greenleaf Christian Church, started the Moral Mondays movement, but also wrote a really powerful book that we've been studying in the ministry where I serve called The Third Reconstruction, where he talks about the need for a new civil rights era and reforms, policy reforms in government, but also societal change to address the issues of systemic violence and racism in our country. Looking at the first Reconstruction, meaning the post-Civil War era, when there were new reforms and inclusion of African Americans in government. African American candidates were being elected to office. There was a new flowering of partnership of often white faith communities and Black faith communities together to work toward addressing issues like poverty and education that were silenced in many ways by the rise of the Klan and other white supremacist groups, not only in the Southeast, but also in places like the Midwest, and they were in the Northeast too. I'm from Indiana, and there are many stories of the Klan in the 1920s and 30s, especially. The Indiana was the capital of the KKK, and so my own family, my forebears were involved in civil rights struggles and struggled a lot against the Klan, even in my own hometown of Indianapolis. And so uh, I bring up the Klan not only, to talk about how pervasive it was in American society, from the Reconstruction, even to present day white supremacist organizations organizing. Barber calls for, and it leads the revival of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign. It was King's last effort before he was assassinated, to highlight the voices and concerns of poor Americans across different racial ethnic groups, across different regional groups, across different careers and paths and experiences, but to talk about poverty in America and to talk about the economic issues that are facing millions of Americans. And King was never really able to bring that to fruition. He was assassinated just as it was getting started. But Barber, in the last few years, along with Presbyterian pastor Liz Theo Harris, have really revived that campaign and are featuring voices, making platforms for poor Americans to speak about their experiences and what they need in policy change. And finally, his organization, Repairs of the Breach, draws upon that concept that he calls fusion politics. Fusion politics came out of is a term from the late 19th century of Black and white activists working together to affect policy change in American government at state and national levels to protect the most vulnerable and marginalized Americans. And so, sort of a sense that we can work together, and we don't have to be siloed into particular issues, but we can create platforms where we can reimagine America. And as the essayist James Baldwin says, achieve our country. I love that phrase. And so different causes coming together to work together to affect change. If you're looking, and I'll share this with Robert and Gerald after our time together. If you're looking to continue to learn, there are some books. Wilda Gafney's Womanist Midrash looks at the women and girls of the Old Testament, and often they are sort of at the sidelines or marginalized in some way, and she brings them front and center and examines what's going on in their narratives. It's a beautiful commentary that's also very accessible. Brian Blunt, I haven't read this book, but it's sort of a companion to his more in-depth commentary on Revelation, called Can I Get a Witness? Reading Revelation Through African American Culture, written more for popular audiences. In preaching texts, Kenyatta Gilbert's Exodus Preaching and Cleo LaRue's I Believe I'll Testify are really accessible introductions to Black preaching traditions if you want to know more about preaching within the context of worship and community in the Black church. If you're looking for things on social justice activism, William Barber's Third Reconstruction, I already talked about, and then also Representative John Lewis, who was also a Baptist minister and civil rights advocate who marched at Selma and helped organize the Selma marches. He co-wrote a graphic novel of his experiences called March, and there are 3 volumes. And they're just a fantastic read and really beautifully illustrated depictions of the civil rights movement, especially in the 50s and 60s. And then for biography and memoirs, I recommend Austin Channing Brown's book, I'm Still Here, and Howard Thurman, who is a mentor to Martin Luther King at Boston University, and also helped desegregate the YMCA, founded one of the first racially integrated congregations in the United States out in San Francisco. His memoir, With Head and Heart, sort of charts the beginning of the nonviolence movement in civil rights in America, inspired in part by his meeting in India with people like Gandhi and talking with the nonviolence movement in India as an inspiration for the United States. So I know that worship is happening soon. Gerald and Robert, if we have time, I'd love to take a question or two if we have time to do that.
Oh, I received a question in the chat that plays up on what you were talking about in my mind when you said the Black church gives a space for Blacks to celebrate their Blackness. So in light of that statement, what do you think the future is for an integrated church?
Yeah, I think, you know, the question for me is, how do we hold the tension of celebrating our neighbors as historically African American congregations, and to engage with them, and to not want to deconstruct that sense of identity and space, while also structuring our congregations in a way that are welcoming uh, to Black people, to people of all different ethnicities, if we're a majority white congregation. And I think, you know, for me, I also serve at Nassau Presbyterian Church, which is maybe not that unfamiliar to First in its makeup, its role in the community. And I think part of anti-racism work is, you know, listening to the voices that are already in our community, uh, inviting them into leadership positions, making space for them to offer up ways that we can introduce new voices, and whether it's music or preaching, engaging in those ways, we can um, see them as influences and voices that can be a part of our worship life too, when they're brought in and introduced by members of our congregation who come from and bring that perspective. I think that's really important. And so I think there's always a tension of not wanting to erase, or the idea that the Black church would go away because of kind of a vision of multiculturalism, but seeing that as something of profound value to our African American neighbors, while also working in anti-racism work to be more inclusive, and putting in leadership, inviting into leadership our neighbors and members.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Other thoughts or reflections from anybody?
Cheryl?
Yes.
I wonder if there is an African-American preacher whom you would recommend to us for us to listen to.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question. So, especially in a pandemic, YouTube is an incredible blessing, right? Because
Right.
more and more churches are finding ways to live stream, to engage in online worship in some way or another. And so we have this tremendous access, and we talk as homiletics, how do we archive these expressions of worship, and they aren't just lost when we return to in-person worship? So I would recommend one of my colleagues, Kevin Vandiver, has been a pastor at the Riverside. He's no longer pastor there. He used to serve at the Riverside Church in New York City.
Right.
He actually preached a couple weeks ago at Nassau Presbyterian Church and delivered a fantastic sermon. So you can, that's a plug for my own congregation. But Kevin is deeply rooted in African American preaching traditions, and that's also his area of research. Teresa Thames is a friend and colleague, Thames. She's a Duke Divinity grad, but she's one of the deans of religious life at Princeton University. You can find some of her preaching on YouTube. Cleophas LaRue, my mentor, you can find some of his sermons on YouTube. Really wonderful and powerful preaching. Brian Blunt's fantastic. I would recommend him any day of the week. Yvette Flunder is another. She is a UCC pastor who preaches often on issues of LGBT inclusion, especially within Black churches, which is a very, kind of particular and specific concern in many churches, and an open question and debate. And she really represents a powerful voice for queer inclusion and celebration in the church. I mean, Kenyatta Gilbert, whom I mentioned, is fantastic. Wilda Gaffney, who I referenced, she is an Episcopal priest and preacher, and I'm always floored whenever I get to read or hear a sermon from her. And finally, someone who passed away 4 or 5 years ago, who was often called the Prince of African American preachers, is Gardner Taylor. And he was a pastor in New York City who had maybe a 40 or 50 year preaching career, just an astonishing range of work. Used to preach on the NBC Preaching Radio Hour. He was nationally syndicated on when radio was a really popular medium for Sunday preaching, and really represented some of the best of African American preaching for decades. And many people in African American preaching today are really indebted to his example. That's a wonderful, thank you for that wonderful question. I love talking about Black preaching and offering examples.
That is a great way for us to carry on beyond just today. And we'll get this class posted with your list of books and with a list of pastors we might look at on our own. So really, really grateful that you could be with us, Andrew, and appreciate your perspective, bringing it into our congregation. So if there aren't any more questions, we will say thank you again to Andrew. And
well, Gerald, thank you so much again for inviting me. Thank you all for being wonderful listeners and conversation partners. I wish I could be hanging out with you in Charlotte right now, but all the best to you, and hope to see you in person someday soon.